All right, welcome. This week, Pastor Ted and Aaron are on a cruise celebrating their 25th anniversary. And so myself tonight and Joe on Sunday are trying to fill in the best we can while the brain and the heart of the church are not here this week, you know. And so tonight, Pastor Ted specifically asked, he made a special request on what I would teach on. I don't know if you guys know this, but he and I went to the same school, and there is a professor there named Gary Habermas. And Gary Habermas pioneered a way of arguing for the resurrection called the minimal facts argument for the resurrection. And so he specifically asked me to teach on the minimal facts argument for the resurrection. So like normal, when I'm up here, we're going to do apologetics. Apologetics is just giving a defense for something you believe in, and we're in church, so we're giving a defense for a Christian worldview. But unlike normally I am arguing for reliability of the Bible. So we'll say X event in history happened, the Bible records it, here's all this corroborating evidence for that thing. Or we're answering what someone might say is a contradiction in the Bible, and we harmonize the two things, or we look at all these different accounts and how they fit well together like puzzle pieces. That's an indication that there's truth behind it. And so those kinds of arguments are what we call reliability arguments. Tonight is not going to be like that. It's going to be different. And so first I could talk about how Gary came across the idea for the argument and stuff like that, and then we'll start talking about why this is going to be different. Gary Habermas, when he was in college, he did the same thing that most of us do when we're that age, which is he began to question his Christian convictions that he received from his family and his parents. And so most of us realized when we're in our early 20s that most of our beliefs were just sort of inherited. We didn't develop them on our own. And so, but the unique thing about Gary is, while he was going through that sort of crisis, the thing that compounded that crisis was he was going to school for New Testament. And if you go to a secular school for New Testament, you will learn a lot of things that you didn't know before, and you will learn a lot of different perspectives that you didn't know before. If you could imagine there being three groups of perspectives on the Bible. Now, you can think about this as a spectrum, but people are going to cluster in three groups. On the one end of the spectrum, all the way over here, is going to be people like you sitting in the pews that think the Bible is divinely inspired, without error, not only without error, but incapable of having error because it's God's breathed word, right? And that's most Christians in the pews and most pastors in conservative churches think that about the Bible. In the middle of the spectrum would be people that think the Bible is reliable, that it records true things, but that maybe there are some errors in there that you could find somewhere. The spectrum, and the opposite end of the spectrum is people who think the Bible is unreliable, right? And those would be non-Christian, highly skeptical New Testament scholars, right? And so I don't know if you know this, but many New Testament scholars never become Christians, or they were, and they are no longer. And that a large part of that is because they take a very, very skeptical view of what the New Testament says about things. Everything will be examined under a microscope. And so Gary, learning arguments from all ends of the spectrum, has a major crisis of faith. But one day, actually when he's getting ready to do his dissertation or pick a topic for his dissertation, he asked the question, well, what do the people who say the Bible is unreliable, what do they accept as facts? What do they say undergirds the beginning of Christianity, right? And so he went mining for those facts, for what we call historic bedrock, right? And so Gary's minimal facts actually accept the premise: the Bible is unreliable. But what he does after that is say, but what facts do you admit, skeptics admit, are true? And he also asks the question, which facts are best supported by the evidence, right? So Bible and non-Bible or non-biblical sources. And so this is where the birth of what's called the minimal facts argument. And so what Gary did, criteria, 90% of historians have to affirm something as a fact for it to make the cut. Also, the fact has to have multiple sources supporting it, okay? And so unlike what we're normally doing, which is showing the Bible is reliable, right? Tonight what we're going to do is to show that the beginning of Christianity requires some facts to have happened. Some events in history had to have happened. And that is basically how the minimal facts came about. Right? And so before we talk more about how he got those facts, what sort of evidences are we going to look at? Does anybody have any questions as to what we're going to do? Yeah. It's called minimal facts. Yes, sir. Yeah. It's called minimal facts. And that's just because it's contrasted with what I'm normally doing, which is maximal data. I want to show as many true things that the Bible records as possible that I can show with evidence and corroboration. And the minimal fact says, I'm not arguing for that. What the minimal facts is going to do is, what Gary discovered was that if you believe the Bible is a divinely inspired word of God, then God raised Jesus from the dead. If you believe the Bible is a reliable collection of ancient documents, God raised Jesus from the dead. Even if you believe the Bible is an unreliable collection of ancient documents, God raised Jesus from the dead, right? And so that's the goal of the minimal facts argument, is to say, I'm not going to argue with any of those things. What I want to do is say, what do the skeptics grant as true? Now, what best explains those things that they grant as true, right? Anybody else? All right. So, like I said, the things he's going to take that are historically certain are affirmed by over 90% of scholars. He'll usually say the phrase virtually all scholars, because you're always going to find quack jobs, right? You're always going to find quack jobs. And I have multiple sources behind this. In doing this, he discovered this list of facts surrounding the beginning of Christianity, and that's why this is called the minimal facts. He doesn't want to argue for anything he doesn't have to. If God raised Jesus from the dead, Christianity is true. Right? That's not going to tell you whether to go to a Baptist church or a Catholic church, but it's going to tell you God raised Jesus from the dead, right? And that means death has been conquered. The Son of God reigns, right? And so, anyway, the three categories we're going to look at as evidence. They're going to come from Paul, what we're going to call oral tradition, and other writings. The way to remember it is POW. Paul, oral traditions, and other writings. Now, Paul's letters are given a special category because skeptics love Paul. The reason skeptics love Paul is because he was an educated man. He was not an original part of the movement. So he comes with an outsider's perspective at the beginning. They have a lot of his writings so that you can learn his personality. He seems to be genuine and trying to tell the truth. And he gives firsthand experience. Firsthand experience. I've seen the risen Lord, right? And so when you're doing historical work, that first-hand experience is crucial. The same as doing detective work. You don't want hearsay. You want what someone actually saw, right? And so that's why Paul is given his own special category, even though it's going to overlap very much with the other ones. Now, oral tradition is mostly scholarship has found creeds embedded in the New Testament. And all a creed is an easily memorized statement or collection of statements that reads with a cadence, or it's easy to tell that it's memorizable. And we do this still with children when we teach them the ABCs, right? You don't just read letters to them, you sing them to them. And that allows children who don't know anything about what letters are really for to memorize the entire alphabet at a young age, right? And so you can imagine if the New Testament church is mostly illiterate people, right? How do you teach them all the core doctrines of Christianity? You teach them these creeds. And we're going to go over the most, what do you want to call it? The most prominent one in the New Testament. It comes from 1 Corinthians 15, and it has a lot of flags, so you can try to spot creeds when you see them pop up in the text. But 1 Corinthians 15, I want to say 5 to 8, is like the most prominent creed found in the New Testament. And there are indicators there for that. Now, the last one is other writings. Now, other writings are just going to be relevant first century documents talking about facts. And those are going to include the other New Testament documents, so the Gospels, Acts, other letters. They're also going to include other Christian writings from the first and early second century. And then they're going to include non-Christian historical writings from the late 1st and early 2nd century. And so those are given a different category from Paul because skeptics view them very skeptically, right? It's not so much like Paul. And so, at no point is the minimal facts argument going to treat the Bible the way that we normally treat the Bible, which is, well, it's true because the Bible said so. And so, okay, before we start to talk about the facts, does anybody have any questions about the method we're about to use or the 3 categories of evidence? Yeah. Yes, I actually had a lot of stuff, but I didn't know what I was doing when I got here, and so I messed up. Yeah, no, absolutely. And also I can talk to you about books used for research for this. Gary Habermas has been writing on the minimal facts for a long time. The list will actually grow and shrink according to what mood he's in sometimes, right? And he's had as many as 12 and as few as 4 on the list. It's not that he doesn't think they're facts sometimes, and sometimes he does. It's just he's just always working on formulating the argument. And so today we'll easy to remember 5, and we'll talk about evidences for each one. And so the first fact is Jesus died by crucifixion. Now, you may have heard of people called Jesus mythicists. Jesus mythicists think that Jesus, all of the Jesus story is just a myth, right? And so that position is not taken seriously by historians at all. Bart Ehrman is, I've mentioned him before when I was up here. He is the world's most popular author on the topic of religion. He is an ex-evangelical New Testament scholar. But one thing he says is there is nothing more certain than that in history, that the man Jesus of Nazareth existed, and that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. And so we're going to go over a handful of sources there. This is a minimal fact. It's a bedrock historic fact. The reason it is because, 1, Paul writes about it a lot, right? And 2, the Gospel and Acts write about it a lot. 3, obviously other New Testament letters write about it. Now remember, we are not using the Bible as one thing. The New Testament is now, to us, 27 unreliable first century historical documents. Now, but once you pile up enough evidence or enough testimony, a historical fact becomes undeniable, right? And so not only do we have those, but outside of the New Testament, we have a Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, who, this is a short quote, "When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified." Now that's a blurb from a passage about Jesus. And Josephus is going to come up again later when it comes to the Lord's brother. But Josephus is a non-Christian writing toward the end of the 1st century about a man named Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified and whose brother later becomes the leader of his movement. And so you begin to see that this sort of becomes historically undeniable. Eventually, this thing happened, and that's where we get these minimal facts from. The next one is a Roman historian named Tacitus. And Tacitus said, "Nero fastened the guilt of the burning of Rome and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations." Now, most people interpret this as Tacitus saying that Nero lied. Nero burned Rome, and he needed somebody to blame when the people didn't like him very much for it, so he blamed Christians. Everybody already hated Christians, so they were his scapegoat. He just said the Christians did it, and they began to torture them. And we carry on, called Christians by the populace. Now that, in another lesson we mentioned, that actually corresponds to Luke in Acts. Christians didn't call themselves Christians at first. Other folks called them Christians, right? They usually use the phrase like the way or something like that, you know. Anyway, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty. The extreme penalty is a polite way of saying crucifixion. Crucifixion was actually considered like a dirty word to say. It was so terrible, so shameful that this was the polite, in polite academic conversation, you just said the extreme penalty. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one procurator, Pontius Pilate. Right? And so, again, that's a Roman historian confirming that fact. Lucian, a Greek writer, also says, "The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. Right? And so each of these serve as blocks of evidence to say, we got a wall here. This is a bedrock fact that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by Pontius Pilate. And so, does anybody have any questions on the first fact? Any questions on the first fact? All right. The next fact. We get it? Okay. His followers believed they saw the risen Jesus. All right. And so you'll notice already that we're using sort of neutral language. We didn't say that they saw them; they believed that they saw him, right? And so, without a doubt, this is a historical fact. The reason that is because we have Paul and some oral tradition to go off of, and this is where we're going to take a look at 1 Corinthians 15. The reason we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 15 is because you're going to see how these things are going to overlap. 1 Corinthians 15, starting in verse 3. Oh, no, I think I'm actually starting before that. Now, I want to make clear for you, brothers and sisters, the gospel I preached to you, which you received, on which you have taken your stand, and by which you are saved, if you hold to the message I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. Now, Paul is about to tell them, this is the message I told to you that is saving you right now. Right? So this is of the utmost importance. Now I'm reading out the CSB, so it'll be different than the New King James that's over there. But he's about to tell them the message that he preached to them, and it's the message that is saving them right now. For I passed on to you, as of most important, what I also received. I think the New King James says, first of all, right? And that's not talking about the order in which you said it. It's just like when your wife is mad at you and she says, first of all, right? So the most important thing we're about to talk about right now is about to come out of her mouth, right? And so it's the same thing in the New King James there. First of all, and then the reason, one of the first flag that flies up, that this is going to be a creed, that Paul's about to cite something that everyone can say verbatim in the church at the time, is because he says, I passed along to you what I also received. And what New Testament scholars have found out is that that language is the same language that Pharisees used to talk about things they had taught their students, things that they expected them to know. And so they passed on what they'd received from their teachers, right? And so Paul's about to tell them this creed, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. And so we see again that first fact get affirmed, right? That Christ died. It doesn't say on the cross, but that Christ died according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's just Peter, then to the 12, then he appeared to over 500 brothers and sisters at one time. Most of them are still alive, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one born at the wrong time or out of due time, he also appeared to me. All right? And so we see he appeared to Peter, the 12, 500 people at one time, a group called all the apostles. Right? And so what you see here is Paul citing an oral tradition, and that's how these things can overlap. Right? It's an oral tradition that Paul is citing. And so this serves as evidence that the early church began to preach this right away. The reason we'd say that is Paul says this is of first importance. Now, a few years in the letter to the Galatians, in the first chapter, he tells you a few years after his conversion, he went to meet Peter and James to compare notes. And he says there that they added nothing to me and that they extended the right hand of fellowship. Right? And so we know that by the time he got there, he spent 2 weeks with them, figuring out if they were preaching the same gospel. The latest Paul could have learned this is in the mid-30s. If this is the central Christian message of first importance, the latest time he could have possibly learned it is from Peter and James in the mid-30s. The latest, the most skeptical scholars could say that he learned it is 51 when he wrote this letter. So within a couple of decades, at the very latest, Christians were saying, we have seen the risen Jesus. We have seen the risen Jesus. Now, are there any questions about the use of 1 Corinthians? It's Galatians 1, like verse 18, somewhere in there. when he talks about going to meet Peter and James. Now, we also have a letter from Clement of Rome, which is written toward the end of the first century. Some scholars think it might be the Clement mentioned in the letter to Rome. Therefore, having received orders and complete certainty caused by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, and believing in the word of God, they went with the Holy Spirit's certainty, preaching the good news that the kingdom of God is about to come. And so what we have here is a Christian from the first century writing, describing the apostles, right? Describing what the apostles are doing, and he's saying that the reason they were the way they were was because they believed they had seen the risen Lord, right? And so we work to establish this bedrock fact, not only with Paul's letters and obviously other New Testament documents, right? The list is probably too long to list of other New Testament documents, but there are tons of New Testament documents that reference the appearances after the resurrection. Every gospel, other than maybe the short ending of Mark, Acts, all of Paul's letters, Peter, which we haven't gotten to Paul yet, but yes. And so we can take this as another bedrock fact. Fact number three. Paul, an enemy of the church, was converted by a similar experience. Right? And so until you hit this fact, you could say it's a conspiracy, right? Or a mistake. Somebody had a hallucination, it's a mistake. But when you do that, you run into Paul. Paul, who was not a friend of Jesus, who, for all we know, didn't know about him until after his death. For all we know from his own writings, was an enemy of the church, persecutor of the church, right? And so Paul, an enemy of the church, was converted by a similar experience. The first source there we have is Paul and a few letters mentioning that, his conversion, and his mentioning of being a persecutor of the church of God. The next one we have is actually an oral tradition that Paul brings up right around that at the beginning of the book of Galatians. He says, he's quoting the Galatians. He who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. Now, in the context of that quote, he's saying that they used to say that about him. And so that's Paul, again, referencing something that's transmitted by word of mouth. Christians used to say that. When they heard about Paul, they're like, oh, man, the guy that used to persecute the church is now preaching. And so Paul here is, again, this is going to overlap. This is Paul and a tradition that he's citing. And then, obviously, the book of Acts and 1 Peter mentioning Paul. We have ample early evidence to say that this fact is sort of historically undeniable. And so does anybody have any questions about the third fact? So far we have Jesus crucified. His followers at the time, shortly after, say they've seen the risen Lord. And then now we have the conversion of Paul. And so the next fact number 4, is James, the Lord's brother, is converted by a similar experience. Now, we don't have as much going for James, but we do have that 1 Corinthians 15 passage, right? So what you have to do is piece together, in the Gospels, the Lord's family is not exactly supportive, right? Especially his brothers are mentioned. They're not supportive of his movement. Something happened, though, that by the time 62, 63 AD, James is martyred for being a Christian in Jerusalem. In the book of Acts, James is the leader in the church. If you want to read Acts 15 in the council, it is James who stands up and says, we're going to do the X, Y, and Z. Right? He listens to everybody talk, and then boom, it is James who does that. And so what happened in the middle? What happened from the time when Jesus is on the earth and they think he might be crazy, right? Or when they're teasing him almost, go ahead and get yourself killed, to James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem. What happens in the middle? Probably, we could say, then he appeared to James, right? And so we have the Gospel in Acts recording that story for us. We have Paul's 1 Corinthians 15. And then we have Josephus again I don't know. You ever read stuff, but you don't say it out loud? You know what I mean? I don't know if I was ready for this. Hegesippus. Hegesippus. That's how I'm going to say it. Hegesippus. And then Clement of Alexandria. And so those are, Clement of Alexandria might be the beginning of the 2nd century, but those are a bunch of early sources saying that James, the brother of Jesus, was converted because he saw the risen Lord, his brother. And so you have to ask yourself the question, what would it take to convince you that the Lord, or that your brother was the Lord, right? Probably seeing him after he was dead. Probably seeing him after he was dead. And so that is fact number 4. Does anybody have any questions about fact number 4? Oh, I put Galatians 1 up there because that's where Paul mentions that he went to Galatia and met with James, the Lord's brother. All right, fact number 5. They preached his message, his being Jesus. They preached his message in the face of persecution and were willing to die. Right? And so we have, again, Paul and oral tradition being cited. We have all the other New Testament letters that mention it, the gospel and Acts. Outside of Scripture, though, we have Polycarp writing in around the year 110. For they did not love the present age, but him who died for our benefit and for our sake was raised by God. In fact, Polycarp goes on to mention the resurrection of Jesus 5 times and how that's the motivation for the church going forward. And so in that quote, he's referencing the apostles, and he's saying, again, the same thing. They did not care about death, right? Goes on to say, because of envy and jealousy, the greatest and most righteous pillars have been persecuted and contended unto death. Let us set the good apostles before our eyes. Now he's going to list them. Peter, so these are the people that contended all the way to death. Peter, who because of unrighteous envy endured not 1 or 2, but many afflictions, having borne witness, went to the due glorious place. Because of envy and rivalries, steadfast Paul pointed to the prize, 7 times chained, exiled, stoned, having become a preacher both in the east and in the west. He received honor fitting of his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world unto the boundary on which the sun sets, having testified in the presence because of envy and jealousy, the greatest and the most righteous pillars have been persecuted and contended unto death. Let us set the good apostles before our eyes. And so this is just an example of early writings where this is the character of the church. This is the character of the church. Peter, who because of unrighteous, I already read that one. The next one is Tertullian, and this is a quote from the late 2nd century or the late 100s. That Paul is beheaded has been written in their own blood, and if a heretic wishes his confidence to rest upon a public record, the archives of the empires will speak, as with the stones of Jerusalem. And so he's saying, if you don't believe the sort of unanimous church testimony that Paul was beheaded, then he says what you can do is go check the Roman, at the time, you can't do this anymore, but he's saying to go check the Roman records because they had to record if they killed a Roman citizen, right? Say again? Right. So at Rome, Nero was the first who stained the blood, with blood of the rising faith. Then is Peter girt by another when he was made fast to the cross. Then does Paul obtain a birth suited to Roman citizenship. And so you'll hear him talk about death. They'll use the word birth because they're being taken from this world into another one. When in Rome, he springs to life again, ennobled by martyrdom. And so then we have specifically Paul being mentioned by Paul, Luke, Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Tertullian, Dionysius, and Origen. And so we have source after source about the church in the 1st century willing to die for the message that they believed God raised Jesus from the dead. They saw Jesus after his death. And so those are our 5 facts. Does anybody have any questions about the facts? I guess I could run through them again real quick. Jesus died by crucifixion. Shortly after, his followers believed that they had seen the risen Lord. Paul, an enemy of the church, is converted. James, the Lord's brother, is converted. And they preach this message in the face of persecution, willing to die. And so those are our 5 historical facts. So does anybody have any questions about those facts so far before we try to explain them? No? No? Okay. So I guess my question to you guys would be, how do you explain the facts? This is just out there. Yeah. Say again? Oh, the source of the fact. What is the source? I'm sorry. Yeah, how do you explain the facts? Like, what's the best explanation for the facts? Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Um, yeah, there's a couple of things there. One, like the rapid explosion of the early church, the Holy Spirit coming and doing a work on people, and just a massive amounts of people converted, even though the church is being persecuted at the beginning. And the other thing is that sort of thing that you said that they were cowards. When you're doing historical work, if something's recorded that's embarrassing, it's almost always true. If it's embarrassing for the people, it's almost always true. If you write down, you have to think, if Peter is the leader of the church in the 50s and 60s, if he is who the Romans think he is, right? Bishop of bishops. And you write down he denied the Lord 3 times. You write down that the Lord told him one time, "Get behind me, Satan." You know what I mean? If you write these things down, they're embarrassing for him to stand in front of you and say, "Yeah, that happened." And it's very likely when you're doing historical work. If it's embarrassing, it's true. It's the same thing with the empty tomb. So some minimal facts arguments will use the empty tomb. And the empty tomb, the reason it's very likely to be true, regardless of how skeptical you are, is it was embarrassing that Joseph of Arimathea had to give him a tomb. Right? A member of the Sanhedrin that condemned him to death felt bad enough that he gave him a tomb. Right? And that's embarrassing because you think if you're writing this in the 50s and 60s or 70s, however late you think the Gospels are getting written, those are like enemy number 1, the Sanhedrin. You look at the sermons that Peter preaches, he says, "You killed him," to the leaders there. You killed him. That's the enemy of the church. But Jesus needed a tomb to stay in. And so, like I said, that's another thing. If a fact is embarrassing, it's very likely to be true. But a lot of arguments, not the minimal facts one, but a lot of arguments will use the Holy Spirit and the fact that the church sort of rapidly exploded at the beginning. And you can contrast that with Islam, because they could say, well, Islam grew rapidly too. Yeah, they were killing everybody that wasn't converting. Like that's very different. If you're killing everybody that's not converting, your numbers grow fast. Some places they're still doing that. Yeah. Some places they figured out better methods. I mean, if you look at the UK right now, it was just like get in and outbreed them because English folks don't have babies. So if you only have like 1.2 babies for every 2 people, and then a bunch of Muslims show up that have 6 or 8 babies for every 2 people, your country's already dead. You just don't know it yet, right? You have a generation and you're gone. And that's what they're seeing now. Look at all the mayoral offices in England, and they're almost all Muslims. Look at the King of England, who just gave like an Easter speech and could not help himself but like compliment Islam. Like, what are we even talking about? They deny the resurrection, and on your Easter speech, you talked about Islam. Anyway, that country's gone. That country's gone. I don't know if there's any turning around outside of them turning to Christ, which doesn't seem like that's going to happen anytime soon. That country is pretty well shot. But all right, so what do you guys think? Non-Christians, how do you think they explain the facts? Christ died by crucifixion. His followers thought they saw him risen afterward. Paul, James converted. and they preach this message in the face of persecution, willing to die. What do you think? How do you think skeptics try to explain that away? Yeah. 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 So I would say that doesn't explain any of these facts. I will say that like in different conversations, I can talk about that. Like, was he just like an apocalyptic prophet or trying to overthrow Rome, sort of like the Jews expected? But in the minimal facts, I would just give that question back and say, which fact does that explain? Okay. Yeah, so you gave a reason why he got killed. And we have 4 facts left. I got 4 facts. You explain 1 fact. Yeah. And I got 4 left. Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. Any explanation we give has to explain all 5 facts. Because that doesn't explain why they saw him afterwards. And that doesn't explain why Paul would convert afterwards. That doesn't explain why his brother would be convinced that his brother is the Lord. That doesn't explain why they would preach that message in the face of persecution. And this is why the minimal facts is so powerful, because you can't throw out some Bible contradiction that you learned on the internet and say, well, what about this? Which facts does it explain? You bring them back to the facts every time. And this is why the method is controversial, because Gary accepted the premise, which most Christians are not willing to accept. Most Christians are not willing to walk over here and say, okay, even if you're right? And it's unreliable. It's just a collection of unreliable documents. Most Christians aren't willing to do that. We stay over here and we argue for reliability. Now, what that means for me is, and I don't mind doing this. I do it all the time. I can argue in circles all day long, and you still walk away not convinced. Maybe I answer 12 Bible contradictions, and you walk away and you're still agnostic or whatever, right? And so I just spun my tires all day talking to you. What Gary's method will do, if you bring up, well, how many angels were there at the tomb? What does that have to do with the 5 facts? Right? What does that have to do with the 5 facts? Because whether you say there were 1 or 2 or none or whatever, you have to explain the crucifixion, the appearances, the conversion of Paul, the conversion of James, and their willingness to preach it in the face of persecution. What does that have to do with the 5 facts, right? And so he doesn't play any of those other games. Any of those. If you ever see Gary Habermas or Mike Licona is the other guy that's now kind of taking the baton. If you ever see them do debates or discussions, if someone does that, stands up and says, what about this Bible contradiction? They won't answer it. They say, books and books have been written about that, but that doesn't have anything to do with my facts, right? What's your? So the reason he chose basically the resurrection, the beginning of Christianity, is because if God raised Jesus from the dead, Christianity is true, right? If God, you could say God led Moses and them out of Egypt and give all the, but it doesn't give you the rest, right? But the central claim in Christianity is death has been conquered by the Son of God, right? And so that he laser focuses on the resurrection. Minimal facts about the resurrection and the church growth after that. And so how do you explain those facts, right? Yeah. So swoon theory being that like the Lord didn't actually die, right? That Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, that he was just looked dead, put him in a tomb, and then somehow he came out later. So one thing is, the first fact is actually that Jesus died. Not that it appeared he died, but that he was dead. And so it doesn't explain that one very well. The second one would be exactly how would, assuming, we have to make a lot of assumptions here. Assuming he doesn't die. And then he doesn't die in the tomb in the next 3 days when he didn't have any medical treatment. And that somehow he pushed the tomb or the stone out of the way or something, right? Does that seem like it would have inspired the rest of the people around him that he's the risen Lord? When you see this bloody, almost corpse-like man walk in the room, you're probably going to think, like, we need to get this guy a doctor, not this guy conquered death. You know what I mean? And so the swoon theory used to be popular, like 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It used to be really popular, but it's basically died. But mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, not on record. Not on record. Yeah. And so back to your point, Romans were really good at killing people. They were the best it's ever been. You know, they got so good at it that they got bored doing the regular stuff, and they came up with crucifixion. You know what I mean? That's pretty wild. And so, yeah, back to your point, they had crucified a lot of people with the 100% success rate. You know, and so the idea that he didn't die, stayed alive in the tomb with no medical attention, came out and inspired, became a liar all of a sudden too, because you also need evidence that, like, for some reason he was going to lie about it when he came out, you know, and that everyone else, yeah. So Gary Habermas has done some work on the Shroud of Turin, right? And he usually says he's like 80% convinced that it's legitimate, but he doesn't use it as part of this at all. You know, the minimal facts is laser focused, but he has gone on record as to say things like, we have not figured out how the image got on there because it doesn't look like ink. It looks like some kind of radiation that was not available, right? The Shroud of Turin is just a shroud. The Catholic Church has it. It's a shroud that they believe was the linen cloth laid on the Lord. Now, it doesn't exactly match the biblical description because there's supposed to be something around his head too, but there is something crazy going on with the Shroud of Turin. I don't ever use it when I'm doing apologetics. I don't ever use it. But there's something weird going on with it in the sense that it has an image burned on it on both sides, because if you imagine a long cloth folded over a person like that, it has his back and his front, and it's not ink. It's something else. Some kind of radiation happened, and you can see wounds and stuff on the person. It looks like Jesus. He's like marks for the crown and stuff. Yeah. 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 Yes. Yeah. That's what a lot of people have said. And now there are knocks against it because they carbon dated it, and it dated to exactly when it showed up in the historical records. It's like the 1100s or something like that. But then they said, well, you carbon dated it on a corner where it had been repaired because of a fire, and it's a debate. And the Catholic Church doesn't let it get tested very often. You know what I mean? So they're kind of weird with their relics, obviously. They're Catholics. But yeah. So it does have some apologetic value, but it's one of those things that's so debated right now. I don't know how much value it is. I kind of focus on New Testament stuff most of the time. What you got? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Oh, yeah. Sure. Sure. Yeah. It would serve as evidence. It wouldn't count as a minimal fact because you'd have to do basically what Gary started. How that research started was cataloging and he's done basically everything in the last 100 years now. Anyone who's written in English, French, German, or whatever the other languages he knows, he has cataloged what they believe happened, right? And so that's how he built that 90% number. And so I don't know if it would qualify as that, but sticking with just the facts that he's established through here, how else does anybody think the facts get explained? What best explains the facts? Not by Christians, but by non-Christians. So we got swoon theory, which doesn't really explain any of the facts very well, but it is a common response. And swoon just means he just didn't actually die. Anybody else? If you were an atheist or a non-Christian, how would you try to explain these facts away? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't know. Yeah. 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 How so? His brother. No, yeah, no, we're role playing right now. Yeah, I just want everyone to see how hard this actually is. Right? Go ahead. Oh, we'll let him. Yeah, yeah, So we haven't said stole the body yet. I was actually waiting for that one. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just going to say this. All those things that you just said could be true. They have not touched the fact. Yeah. So the thing, yeah. Yeah. The thing we bounce it off of usually is Watergate. Like, it was 2 weeks, and people just start cracking. And they weren't getting persecuted like the early church is getting persecuted. You know what I mean? They were just like facing some jail time. But they crack, folded. What you got? Doppelganger. So as funny as this sounds, aliens and an unknown twin brother. No, I know what you're saying. I'm going to get there. Yeah. Well, you didn't say anything. So as funny as it sounds, some critics are so desperate that was an explanation that has been offered before, is aliens and a twin brother that nobody knew about. Now, obviously, that sounds less likely than a resurrection. You know what I mean? I'm just going to say, obviously, that sounds less likely. One, you had a twin brother that James didn't know about, right? Two, you had to convince guys like Peter, who was his best friend, closest companion. Three, like, where did he go afterward? Because we believe the Lord ascended on high. You know what I mean? And so, what? So this is, I will say this, though. Yeah, and so, okay, if I was doing reliability, I would make a case. Boom, yes, there were times, but it says specifically their eyes were made not to see, right? Not that there was something wrong with him, but it was kept from them, right? So if I was doing reliability, I would go down that route and argue that. We'll wrestle on the ground about it, right? But if I'm doing minimal facts, none of that matters to me. That does not touch any of my facts. None of them, right? And so that's why this is has been so successful in moving the needle in New Testament scholarship, meaning that it used to be predominantly non-Orthodox, like neo-Christian people that weren't actually Christians, right? They would deny all kinds of things. But since he made the argument, the needle is actually this way, the majority of New Testament scholars right now are Christians, right? It's a slight majority, but it's a majority, right? And so this is why I keep going back to the fact. Go back to the 5 facts. And sometimes it's 6, and sometimes it's 4, but go back to the 5 facts. And most of the things, they don't even touch the facts. Now, you got one good, that they stole the body. Okay, so maybe he did die. And then they stole the body, and they made up this story. The thing about lying is, you lie to get out of trouble most of the time. You know what I mean? Or you lie to get something. So you have to ask the question. This is what we do with Joseph Smith, right, in the Mormon church. With Mormonism is true. Well, a lot of weird things are true. But the fact is, he got something out of it. He got a huge cult following. He got a lot of money. He got a lot of influence. He got, obviously, tons of wives. And when you ask the question, why would they do that? When they just got ostracized by the people around them, you know what I mean? When the Jews now that at least used to be your people aren't your people anymore, and the Romans that already hated you hate you more because you're just causing conflict. When people refuse to do business with you, I have to tell the teenagers this all the time, but if people refuse to do business with you back then, that's a death sentence. If you're a grain farmer, you need other stuff to stay alive, you know what I mean? You have to be able to trade and barter with people, and people just won't do that, And so the idea that they stole the body and made it up, one, it fails right away on their sort of sincerity of believing. They preached his message in the face of persecution, willing to die. But also, it doesn't account for James or Paul at all. They're not members of the original movement, right? They're converted later. And the earliest source we have says the reason that happened was because he appeared to James. And then last of all, he appeared to Paul, right? And so most of the responses you're going to get, the point I want to drive home is most of the responses you're going to get are going to fly right by the facts. They might be interesting to talk about. Obviously, I've gotten up here and talked about a lot of them. But they're not going to hit your minimal facts. So, yeah. Right, yeah. Caiaphas, everyone was right, For, a couple days, they probably were thinking, like, hey, we were wrong about this. Obviously, Friday to Sunday, Friday to Sunday. Would have been interesting to have been in the room, But it would have been interesting to sit down with Peter, Paul, and James when he spent 2 weeks with them to learn Are we preaching the same gospel? That sort of thing. So, does anybody have any other explanations? Gears turning. At the tomb? Mm-hmm. Mm-mm. Yep, nope. Mm-hmm. It is in the Bible. And so if you're in this group over here that I stood over here and said earlier, if you're over here, it's in the Bible. That thing happened, right? If you're in the middle over here, you're saying it's reliable. You're going to say, oh, one account says one angel, one says two. If somebody says, if I went like this, I went to the store yesterday, and then I said, Story and I went to the store yesterday. I didn't tell you two different things, right? I told you more information the second time than I told you the first time, right? One angel and two angels is not a contradiction. That's not how that works, right? And so maybe one author focused on the one angel that spoke, and maybe one author wanted to tell you more about what was going on. That's all you have to do to iron that out. If I'm doing minimal facts, I don't care about that. Like that's Jamie with his reliability hat on. But Jamie over here with his minimal facts hat on, I'm going to say it does not matter how many angels were at the tomb. I need you to try to explain these 5 facts for me, right? I need you to try to explain these 5 facts to me. And like I said, like we're seeing here, it's hard to do. Yeah. Yeah, you're good. Say again? Oswald what? Oh, I don't know. Oh. Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yes. Um, yeah. So, which of my facts are you attacking right now? Which of my facts? Yeah, which of the facts are you attacking right now? Okay, I got you. Yeah, so I got you. One thing you're going to run into there in the example with JFK and stuff is the degrees of separation. Like, most of us are not at all intimately equated with the facts of the case, right? And so we're just kind of getting bits and pieces through things. The problem with my 5 facts that you're going to run into is that the initial followers that are converted are intimately aware of the facts, right? They were followers of the Lord, and they say they saw him afterward. Then the next 2 people, his brother, right, we would say is intimately aware of the facts. And then we would say Paul is persecuting the church for a reason. Why is he persecuting the church? They claim that man was the Messiah, that he died and he rose again, right? And that is blasphemy, okay? And so those people are all intimately aware of the facts. They're not, and when we say they're willing to die for what they're preaching, they're not like a Muslim willing to fly a plane into a building based on 1,400-year-old story. They're willing to die based on what they have experienced, firsthand experience. It's not someone taught them these things like us. It's not like us. The Christian martyrs today are still a glorious testimony to the power of the resurrection and the Lord and his goodness. But nobody's testimony is like the first generation's testimony. Nobody's is. Not for evidence, for sure. Because when a person is willing to die for something they say they saw, that means something. When a person is willing to fly a plane into a building and kill a bunch of other people because of something made up 1,400 years before that, then that doesn't. Yes. And that's why the minimal facts focuses on that, right? Right, exactly. Like I said, when a cop is doing an investigation, he doesn't need to hear all the hearsay. He needs to hear firsthand accounts, right? And so, anybody have any alternative explanations? Because the Christians have one, right? We have the simplest one. God raised Jesus from the dead, right? He had to be dead to do it. That's the first fact. That makes sense of why the disciples saw him, right? That makes sense of why James, his brother, saw him and became a Christian. That makes sense of why Paul, the persecutor of the church, turned his life around. That makes sense of why they were all willing to die. They were all preaching his message in the face of persecution, right? And so the Christian explanation makes sense of all 5 facts. You just saw how I did that. That was very easy. Now, the other ones I got, you said Jesus didn't really die. One you alluded to, sort of, is a hallucination theory. Okay, hallucination theory is the idea that they were grief-stricken after he died, and maybe Peter has a hallucination of him and is convinced that he saw the risen Lord, and then sort of legend develops after that. Now, what facts do you think that does not explain well? What facts do you think that does not explain? That 500, yes, and that's part of the evidence. It's not considered a fact, though. That's part of the evidence to build the facts, but it's not considered a fact. But yes, it does not explain the 500. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. See, there you go. So that's the thing. But some of the evidences that we use to establish the facts, it's not going to explain very well. But specifically, out of the 5 facts, which one doesn't explain? Which ones aren't explained well? Yeah. There you go. You can't share hallucinations. If we all did mushrooms together, we're not all tripping the same, right? That's just not how it works. This is not how it works. The other thing is, there's no reason to think that James or Paul would have those hallucinations, like you said. There's also no reason to think that the initial getting off the ground works, meaning that if they all did have their own personal hallucinations, and then they all like convened and said, yep, this is the thing. The problem is we have a lot of evidence around hallucinations, and they never work that way. You can't find hallucinations where normal functioning people have hallucinations and then they change their life based on hallucinations. That's just not a thing. So yeah, hallucination doesn't do very well. Jesus followers lied. We talked about that a little bit. We talked about aliens and the unknown twin brother. And then, like I said, that's basically it. Those are the responses. And so if you listen to Gary Habermas or read him or Mike Licona books nowadays, what you'll find is the responses have kind of dried up. What you'll find is a lot of people say, you have some interesting data, I just can't follow you to your conclusion. What you're going to find is they are committed to the fact that there is no God that's going to judge sin. They're committed to the idea that the natural world is all there is. Physical things are all there are, right? And so you can read the books for yourself. You can watch Gary Habermas give lectures. But generally speaking, nowadays, the responses to him and the minimal facts are, that's some interesting information, but they will refuse to try to explain the facts because they know they're backed into a corner. So, yeah. And that's the minimal facts case for the resurrection. I know it wasn't the typical Bible study for Wednesday nights, but I hope you learned something, Do we have any questions about the minimal facts before we're done? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the stolen body thing doesn't work for all sorts of reasons. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And so the big thing is if you want to learn the minimal facts argument, and it's called an argument, but that's just like scholarly jargon. You're not supposed to be arguing with people like arguing with people. If you get in a discussion and you bring up the minimal facts, when you're doing it, drag them back to the minimal facts. Because what is always going to happen is they're going to shoot off over here and shoot off over here. And what I want to keep saying is, you didn't even hit my facts. You did not hit the fact. You did not try to explain them at all. Well, how many, and it's, okay. But anyway, yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, what's up? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So most of the time, this is a misconception about debates. Most of the time, the debate is for the people in the audience, right? I'm not going to change his mind. He's not going to change my mind. Both of us are well versed enough that we know what you're going to say most of the time. If you've prepared for a debate, you know what they're going to say before they say it, and they know what you're going to say, right? And really, we watch debates for the cross exam at the end to see who's the quippiest, you know. But the debate is usually for the people in the audience, you know. And so I don't need a number of facts. I just need an explanation of the facts. You know what I mean? I got these 5. How do we explain them? And so normally, like I said, normally I'm doing reliability stuff, and I'll answer whatever. Like you said, it's kind of weird in a conversation to try to get that scholarly, especially most of us are like blue-collar people anyway. Like most people wouldn't even know what the heck I was talking about, you know? But if you can remember 5 facts, and then you can just remember the acronym from the earlier, POW, P-E-O-W, the reason these things are facts are Paul, oral traditions that we rely on, and the writings from other people. That's inside the Bible, outside the Bible, Christian and non-Christian. And if you can just list the facts and tell them that the facts are affirmed by 90% of scholars, that they all have multiple sources supporting them, and that Paul oral tradition writing, if you can do that, most people are going to be like, oh, okay, well, and then they will try to explain the facts to you, right? And you say, well, Christian just says God raised Jesus from the dead. All 5 of these facts make sense. God raised Jesus from the dead. And so my advice would always be don't be overly argumentative, but yeah. Mhm. Oh, yeah. 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 So as far as that goes, there are criteria that historians use to determine something as a sort of bedrock fact that you can't deny. One of them is what I talked about earlier. It's called the criteria of embarrassment. If something's embarrassing written down for the author or someone important to the author, it's probably true. You know, the other one is like corroborating other testimonies together, and you know, there are different methods they use to determine facts. One of them is the number of close early sources, right? But the problem with bringing out the number of manuscripts in the Bible is that, yeah, we have a few in the first few centuries, and then we have, right after that, you have this explosion, right? And so if you're talking about a few hundred years down the road, and now you got 1,000, you know, and then, you know, you go 1,000 years down the road and you got tens of thousands of manuscripts, none of that serves as evidence. That'd be like me hitting print, you know what I mean? And so what they want to do is try to get the best they can to original manuscripts. Like you're saying, the Jesus killed by crucifixion, that's attested by 9 sources from the first century. 9 sources. That's better than most Caesars, you know, and the things about their life that early, you know. So, anything else? Anybody got any more questions? Ted will be back next Wednesday. I think the kids are going to be getting rowdy here pretty soon, so we're going to. Yeah, yeah. No, not at all. Yeah, 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 yeah. I do like everyone should know that it is not your job to convert people. You know what I mean? The Holy Spirit convicts of sin. The Father draws. The Son draws all men to Himself. Like it is not your job to convert people. Um, as an apologist, usually the way we'll say it is we're removing obstacles, but the faith thing is on you. You know, the belief thing is on you. So. Um, could remove an obstacle if somebody came and said something, and I have this problem with the Bible, and maybe I could explain it in a way that made sense. But at the end of the day, I don't convert anybody, you know. But yes, I appreciate that. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, no, I appreciate it. Anyway, we'll close in a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Heavenly Father, we come to you in the name of your risen Son and the help of your Spirit. Thank you for the resurrection and the freedom to talk with those around us